One of the most important things to do when looking at an argument essay is look at the issue and how it affects different people, different groups, and different issues. This will help us to do so. Our first issue is the New York SAFE Law. New York legislation passed the SAFE Law that puts restrictions on who and how firearms are purchased, as well as how they are monitored thereafter. While supporters argue this law will prevent violence proactively, naysayers argue that this law violates civil liberties, promotes stereotypes as well as racist profiling, and restricts economic growth. There are different issues within the law, different provisions. The first provision that we have with the law is to further restrict assault weapons to define them by a single feature, such as a pistol grip. Current law requires 2 features. 2. Make the unsafe storage of assault weapons a misdemeanor. 3. Mandate a police registry of assault weapons. 4. Establish a state registry for all private sales with a background check done through a licensed dealer for a fee, excluding sales to immediate relatives. 5. Require a therapist who believes a mental health patient made a credible threat to use a gun illegally to report the threat to a mental health director, who would then have to report serious threats to the State Department of Criminal Justice. A patient's gun could be taken from him or her. 6. Ban the internet sale of assault weapons. These are just parts of the issues within the law. There are more. The 7th part of the law requires stores that sell ammunition to register with the state, run background checks on buyers of bullets, and keep an electronic database of bullet sales. 8. Restrict ammunition magazines to 7 bullets from the current national standard of 10. Current owners of high-capacity magazines would have a year to sell them out of state. Someone caught with 8 or more bullets in a magazine could face a misdemeanor charge. 9. Require that stolen guns be reported within 24 hours. Otherwise, the owner would face a possible misdemeanor. 10. Increase sentences for gun crimes, including for taking a gun on school property. 11. Increase penalties for shooting first responders, called the Webster provision. 2 firefighters were killed when shot by a person who set a fire in the western New York town of Webster last month. The crime would be punishable by a law in prison without parole. 12. Limit the state records law to protect handgun owners from being identified publicly. The provisions would allow a handgun permit holder to maintain a privacy under the Freedom of Information Law. 13. Require pistol permit holders or those who will be registered as owner of assault rifles to be recertified at least every 5 years to make sure they are still legally able to own the guns. The images that are after this slide contain a picture of what type of an effect keeping this law might have on both the local and global scales. As you watch the clips, I want you to take notes identifying who it affects and how. Then afterwards, go through and determine if the image addresses a local or global effect, as well as how the effects are interrelated. So let's look at the first, local effect. This issue doesn't really address family, but it does address the community. If there's an increase in crime, we could see an increase in crooked cops taking bribes, Second Amendment, unenforceable, law enforcement stretch, no trust in cops. We could also see the affluent moving out of the area, which could increase poverty and crime. So if there is an increase in crime, what kind of an effect would it have on the smaller local scale? First, let's look at one city and how it's changed over time. Crenshaw, California. In the 1930s and 40s, it was an affluent area. There were a lot of crime issues, and if you'll see this picture, demonstrates that it was a place of prosperity. Yet, as things began to change and crime increased, it changed where the affluent started moving out of this area, and there was a climate change within the area. No longer were people that were more affluent living here, but poverty increased and crime increased instead. And now we have the current Crenshaw area, which is considered not very safe by many. Let's look back at local effects. The next one we see is crooked cops and law enforcement stretched. Law enforcement stretched is not because of their desire for it to be stretched, but because there are few law enforcement and high crime rates. They are further taxed and unable to prevent some crimes. Crime increasing leads to law enforcement stretch, and because of this, many start to lose faith in cops. They don't look at the police officers as people who can prevent crimes, but instead they look at law enforcement as those who merely react to crimes. Because of this, the feeling of safety is lost. The faith in police and law enforcement is also lost. One sheriff in New York was stating different things about this law. He said first that it violates the Second Amendment and he doesn't agree with it, so he isn't led to enforce it. Another thing that he said is that there were so many issues within the law and so many restrictions that it made it so that it was broad and unenforceable. Both of these lead police not wanting to enforce the law. So a new question comes forth is this going to be like it was in the 1920s and 30s mafia era, where maybe law enforcement takes bribes? Let's look at global effects next. You'll see that there's an array of global effects. The first, economy. If it affects the economy, there will be a decrease in revenue or profits, which could lead to employers downsizing, which could lead to increase in unemployment. If we look at the national and international scale, nationally it could lead to black market sales within our nation, and internationally it could lead to gun trafficking. Culturally, many people say that it violates the Second Amendment. It could also increase in crime, which may lead to locations with money versus without money having inequity and safety, which could also lead to racial profiling and discrimination. This could also increase cultural violence, the dichotomy of good versus bad, bad being the powerful, the aggressive, the idolized, good lacking control, and because of that, they're not going to be considered a social norm, something that people are going to want to seek out. So what happens if there's a decrease in revenue? Let's look at this current chart. You'll notice in these three areas, there's been a decrease in each, with gun sales dropping. Gun sales dropping show decrease in sales and profit, which could then result in unemployment rising. No longer is there a need to employ multiple because the profits of the businesses are going down. Therefore, people are being laid off. Looking at it on an international scale, this could also increase gun trafficking. The inability to purchase guns locally could result in black market sales as well as the international gun trafficking, which could then make our nation seem like we can't enforce our own laws. Now let's look back at the global effects. The next one we see is we have an increase in crime with locations with money versus without. There are some areas that will have more money, and so there will be able to have law enforcement do the protection they need, whereas there's some without where tax revenue is lower and they may not be able to have the law enforcement they need. So an increase in crime in the global community effect, looking at different areas, will help us to see the inequity, meaning the unfairness, the inequality. One Los Angeles area, Beverly Hills for instance, you'll see that Beverly Hills is an affluent area that is well protected. Looking at lots of images, we don't see any safety images. Whereas if you look at another area that is also Los Angeles area, Compton, often poorer areas are not so much protected, and this leads to inequity and safety. Residents begin to feel that they have to protect themselves and that there's not a law enforcement that is able to handle the scope of the crime problems. This also leads to racial profiling because many times people think, why are you in this affluent area and you must also be in this? There's been these issues in the Los Angeles community and there have been lawsuits because of it. Images and perceptions often lead to creations of culture and values. For instance, in the Los Angeles area, the thug life is something that is promoted. Increasing issues may lead to the value of culture of violence and aggression as the idealized power because they think that that is what can protect them. Whereas the good, people that are successfully pursuing lives of other options, are not valued. This thereby decreases the scope of options and successes for a larger based community. Now, each of these areas would have to be further researched or explained in an actual essay. But you see how this brainstorming exercise leads you to look at the different levels frequently. Take a moment to go back through the video and jot down additional notes answering the questions I asked you to focus on at the onset of the images. Focus specifically on cause, effect, and interrelation of the issue's effects on different levels. You're going to need to do this each time you get a synthesis essay in order to really have a depth of explanation with your argument and your analysis.